Hello and welcome to The Rundown, a podcast from PoliticsHome. I'm your host, Alain Tolhurst, who will be to discuss the biggest strike day in a decade this week and the even larger day of walkouts to come on Monday, as well as marking Rishi Sunak's somewhat rocky first 100 days as Prime Minister. I'm delighted to say we have Onay Kasab, National Lead Officer for the Unite Union, whose members in a whole range of sectors have agreed a series of industrial action over pay and conditions. Alongside him we have Theresa Villiers, Conservative MP and a former Cabinet Minister, as well as Adam Drummond, Head of Political and Social Research at the polling firm Opinium. So I'm going to start with you, Theresa. Obviously, today, as we record this on Thursday, it's 100 days of Rishi Sunak as Prime Minister. It's known as a double trust, I think, 100 days. I just wondered what you kind of made of those 100 days. There's a lot of questions at the moment whether they've been a bit overshadowed by scandal and strikes. I just wondered how you felt things were going. The last time you were on the podcast was at the last Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. Just wonder what you've made of the time since then.
Yes, well, that podcast that I did for you was more or less the only thing I said on the media across Premiership. I was
feel very, very honoured, Theresa. Thank you.
Keeping fairly quiet about that episode. Well, I mean, the crucially important thing that Rishi's done is to stabilise the economic situation. So we've seen the interest in the rise in interest rates arrested, and we are also, we've also had the autumn statement, which put the public finances back on a stable footing for the future. So that is absolutely crucial. Rishi has also confirmed and extended the energy support package, both for households and businesses, which is another vital achievement in the first 100 days. And continuing with the aid to Ukraine and stepping it up and being the first country to offer tanks, I think, is another important factor in his initial premiership. And the plan to tackle NHS delays and pressure is, for me, particularly crucial. I know many of my constituents are really worried about this, and the plan for more ambulances, more beds, more staff is very welcome. But as I said to the Health Secretary in Parliament, the crucial thing is it's got to be felt on the ground at the front line as soon as possible. And I know the government is determined to do that. So those are some of the key things they've been focused on in the first 100 days. But there is obviously a lot more to do.
Yeah, I mean, those are sort of the good things. And I think especially before Christmas, I spoke to lots of Conservative MPs who felt that things had sort of calmed down after a pretty wild sort of 6 months. But since then, in January, there's still a feeling, I suppose, that there's a bit of a fracture in the Conservative Party. There's lots of new groups popping up, the sort of Conservative Growth Group and etc. And there's people trying to push the Chancellor to perhaps be a bit more bold in the upcoming budget. Last night, on Wednesday night, was the anniversary of the 1922 committee's 100 years at the Hurlingham Club. I understand you were there. What was kind of the mood like there amongst your colleagues? Is it all kind of, you a nest of singing birds, is the phrase I often use, or is there still kind of a bit of kind of hangover from what was a pretty mad 2022 for the Tory party?
There is certainly it's been a welcome relief that under Rishi's premiership we have restored political stability, and that includes stability within the Conservative Party. Of course, we all care a great deal about the issues that brought us into Parliament, so we're not going to agree on everything, but there is far more that unites us than divides us.
Even still, do you think?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I have to confess I did lead a bit of a rebellion myself just before Christmas on planning and housing targets, because I was concerned about the impact that setting very aggressively high targets is having on the ability of local councils to have control over what is built in their neighbourhood. But actually, I think that was resolved in a sensible way. The amendment I tabled attracted 60 names, but in the end, I felt able to withdraw it because Secretary of State Michael Gove listened and came up with some sensible measures which actually do boost the input of local communities in the planning system. So we have, strong debate if people express their opinions, and not least on things like the Northern Ireland Protocol. But I think Rishi has shown himself adept at being willing to listen to backbenchers and actually to look ahead to make sure that we resolve our internal debates so that we can work together, backbenches and frontbenches.
It sounds a bit like a pitch for party chairman. There's a vacancy there, Theresa. Are you putting your name forward for party chairman?
I'm not pitching for that job. I have to say, it's not the easiest in the world given the current political circumstances.
No, obviously not. And on that, Adam, obviously, just talk about the kind of the polling. Obviously, when Rishi Sunak came in, there was an expectation that he would perhaps try and lift the Conservative Party. At the time he came in, his personal ratings were above that of the Conservative Party. It looks like they're sort of slipping a little bit. Just talk to us a little bit about the kind of where the polling is, both in terms of Rishi Sunak personally and where the Conservatives are 2 years out from an election.
Yeah, so a bit like Theresa said, actually, the most important thing that Rishi Sunak did was sort of stabilise the situation after we had that sort of September free-fall crazy month that I'm sure we all remember in different ways. So the difficulty he's got, though, is that just stabilising the situation doesn't take you to an election-winning situation. So the fall in the Conservative Party's overall sort of vote share under Truss, when it went from being sort of in the low 30s to the low 20s, sometimes even in the teens, he's brought that up to sort of, the mid-20s. But obviously mid-20s is still an election wipeout position. The other thing is that, yes, Rishi Sunak was more popular than the Conservative Party more generally. The problem for him is that the party he leads is deeply unpopular, and there's only a certain amount that one leader can sort of fix the brand damage there. The Tory party's brand image was really, really trashed over the course of September and a lot of the summer last year. And what's happening is that Sunak's ratings are coming more into line with where the party is rather than the other way around.
We'll come back to some of those issues, why the Conservative polling is down. But Onay, bringing you in, obviously, your members staged this huge part of this huge walkout yesterday on Wednesday, and obviously going to be part of this big walkout from the NHS and other industries, other sectors on Monday, the 6th of February. Just talk to us why your members have taken this decision and why you think it's kind of such an important moment, I think, for industrial relations at the moment with the government.
Well, the one thing that our members are not seeing is stability. The reality is that our members are going through a cost of living crisis where their wages are not meeting the cost of living, if you like, the ability just to be able to live. We're not talking about luxuries, just to be able to live. And that's happening at the same time, I have to say, that's happening at the same time as a number of companies that we're in dispute with are making bumper profits. And our members can see that. So as well as our members struggling, they are seeing the companies that they work for making profits. Our bus driver members in South West London working for Abellio are currently taking action. You get Abellio are posting huge, significant profits. And that's not isolated. And I think workers see that. Workers can see what's happening. And looking at the public sector, when you get a situation where hospitals are now providing food banks for their own staff, I think that shows you how desperate the situation has got. So our members are taking action because they have unions that are confident and willing to do what is necessary. But don't forget, they have to vote and be balloted for industrial action. That means passing legal thresholds that are in existence at the moment already. And the fact that we can get people over those legal thresholds, and I have to say, ballot thresholds that no MP or local authority councillor would have to get through, the fact that there is that level of support amongst our membership, the level of support amongst the public for those strikes as well, I think is very, very telling. I think everybody can see what's going on, what's happening. And I think the message from us as a trade union, in particular focusing on the NHS, is that we want talks. We want discussion, and that's not happening.
Yeah, you've been involved previously in some talks with Stephen Barclay, the Health Secretary, for your NHS members. You came out and said that those talks are pretty pointless. You felt, that there hadn't been the discussion on pay that you wanted. What have you made, I guess, of the government's response to this kind of wave of industrial action, and how do you see a way through? What do you want to see from ministers? If this more strike action is to be averted, you've obviously announced many more days of industrial actions already. What needs to happen really from the government's point of view?
Well, discussion on the issues that we are actually in dispute over would be a good start. I was in 2 out of 3 of the meetings that have taken place with Stephen Barclay, and I've also had a good briefing from the 3rd meeting. None of those meetings took place for more than 45 minutes, and the key issue that we are in dispute over was not discussed because the minister did not want to discuss it, made it absolutely clear. So we want discussions on pay with regard to 20 2022. That's what we are in dispute over. And what is, I think, particularly galling for our members is when we see statement after statement from the Prime Minister saying that there are constructive talks taking place, there are discussions taking place. Well, as far as the NHS is concerned and our union is concerned, that's not happening. That's not taking place. I think the other thing that was galling, I think there was a lot of briefing done to the press about possible settlements that may be put. Well, I have to make clear again today, no offer has come forward. So there was discussion about a lump sum, there was discussion about bringing forward the 2023 pay anniversary date. None of that has been put forward to the unions. So what we want to see negotiation on the issues we are in dispute over. And outside of the NHS, in the private sector, we want to see those companies that are making huge profits share some of those profits with the workers who are helping them to make that money.
Theresa, bring you back in on this. How have you kind of seen it from your point of view, how ministers have handled it, and what do you want to see? Obviously, no one wants to see teachers walking out, NHS stuff walking out. What do you think needs to happen for this kind of stuff to be resolved? Obviously, it's been talked about Sunak's 100 days. It's kind of been going on for as long as that, really, and it looks like there's no sign of it ending anytime soon.
I completely understand the concern that so many people feel across the country about the rising cost of living and the erosion on the value of their wages. It's, the war in Ukraine has created huge damage in terms of the inflationary surge that it's caused. That's why we've got the big programme to try and help people at this difficult time with their energy bills. But I just do feel that widespread strike action is not the right approach. Of course, all of us want wages to be higher across the board, whether it's the public sector or the private sector. But rushing into big inflation-busting pay rises now could embed inflation, for the medium and longer term, and that makes everybody poorer. I mean, the best thing we can do to assist people with the cost of living is to get a grip on inflation, to halve inflation as the Prime Minister's promised to do. And that is just not reconcilable with some of the pay demands that have been made. So I do hope we can find a resolution on all of this. There are some promising signs that we may start to see inflation stabilise and I hope come down. But I just think the unions and their members really should think again about the disruption that they're inflicting on the rest of the general public and the problems that they are causing, because it's just not possible to write a big enough cheque to answer all the demands for pay rise, as much as I wish it were.
Yeah, but it feels as though there's a difference between 4%, which was the offer for NHS stuff last year, and something that you say is inflation busting. Inflation is still over 10%. There could be a landing zone there which still would be less than inflationary, and that would still be seen as a pay cut for people. It feels like there should be a way forward that doesn't cause either of those kind of issues.
But the government has delivered on the pay review body process, and that has meant wage rises for NHS staff, and indeed for teachers. They've relatively recently had some of the highest wage rises for 30 years. And I think we do have to keep in mind that pension arrangements in the public sector are considerably more generous than is possible or practical for someone working in the private sector. Of course, I understand the concerns felt by public sector workers, but we could end up undermining the value of their future wages if we let inflation take hold. So we've just got to bear in mind what is affordable for the public finances, and borrowing more to fund additional pay increases for this year just leaves more debt for future generations. But I think it's also positive to look ahead to the pay review process for next year and see if there is more that can be done to respond to the concerns.
Yeah. I'm just bringing Onay back in. It looks like that's been the government's kind of, is to try and sort of push this play the long game so that, eventually there's no point reopening 2022 2023 and to talk about 2024 and hope that inflation comes down to a level where, they don't have to give the rise they're looking for. What have you kind of made of that as a strategy?
Sure. As a strategy, it's clearly not working because the strikes are continuing. But I do want to pick up this point about inflation busting pay rises, because that seems to have become the mantra over the last couple of days. I've seen interview after interview where that phrase is used, inflation busting pay rises. It's not workers' wages that caused the problem as far as inflation is concerned. It's now being accepted by wider circles than just the unions. It's about price gouging. Companies are making excess profits by putting prices up artificially to a much higher extent than they need to in order to make profits. The Daily Mail, not a friend of the trade unions, even ran an article about it over just a few days ago. So it's not workers' wages that are putting inflation up. Look, and that point that you made about the difference between 4% and inflation, we have said over and over again, we will negotiate. Unite has been involved over the last year in over 500 disputes, winning 80% of those, putting an extra 200 million into the pockets of our members. And we've done that in the main by sitting down and negotiating. There may have been a dispute that forced the employers to the table, but we've done that through negotiations. And that's what is not happening in a number of these disputes, especially the NHS. If the government's position is that the RPI rate of inflation is too high an amount, we clearly know that the pay review body is discredited. We've had those arguments for some while, and I think yesterday the Department of Health was even missed a deadline to put its own submission into this year's pay review body. So we don't have faith in the process. What we want is to sit down and negotiate. And look, I will say this again today, we are more than willing to compromise.
Adam, just bringing in a part of that government strategy to sort of to play it long, as I guess is eventually hope that, that people start to blame, I suppose, the unions for causing this disruption, and perhaps public support for some of these strikes starts to wane. How is the kind of public support for strikes, and has that changed over the past few weeks or not?
So there's two things. One of them is that it's remarkable how little it's changed over the past couple of weeks, and even actually since last June when we were asking about rail strikes then. So the country's relatively sort of divided on it. There is, depending on sector, more support than opposition for most of the sectors that we test. But that's the other point, which is that it really is divided by sector. So nurses, ambulance drivers, huge public support there for basically the strikes, and my only sort of advice to the government there is just give them what they want. You got to end this. That is not a good political opponent to pick if you're the government. And then you have a more nuanced picture on I think it's teachers and railway workers, where I think there is more public perception that whatever sort of pay setup and with teachers you always get holidays mentioned, but whatever kind of setup and deal they have is more broadly fair than what is being given to nurses and ambulance drivers. And
so that kind of, I suppose, that difference between, I suppose, the polling you talked about for politicians generally, but also for the Conservatives, and the gap in terms of polling in support of the strikes. We've seen that kind of gap, and you think that's a difficulty for the government to face, is that there is that gap between support for them and the other side on this.
Yeah, and when we ask about who you blame for the strikes, generally it's the government that comes out worse off in this. Like I said, it does differ by sector, especially for ones related to the NHS. It's overwhelmingly people blame the government for the strikes. With rail workers, it's a bit more nuanced. But again, like the best picture for the government in that case is that people are blaming the unions in that sense as much as they're blaming the government. Like the best case for the government in that case is a draw rather than an overwhelming loss.
Right. Okay. And so, Theresa, on that then, if there's that difficulty, the public are backing, especially NHS workers. Do you not think that, as Onay says, that there does need to be a negotiation, and it feels as though that reticence to reopen the 22-23 pay dispute isn't going to change? How does the government kind of do this? Is it just waiting until the next pay review settlement for the following year and hope that they kind of keep that going until then?
It is a difficult situation. I mean, we all, as I emphasise, we all want to support NHS workers. We all want to see them paid more, but I think the government does have to stand firm on this. There is scope for discussions about other working conditions and how we tackle that, and obviously the government is also trying to push more resources into the NHS to expand capacity. But I think when it comes to pay, it is the right approach to focus on the negotiations and the pay review process for the financial year starting at the end of March. I think if we see the government cave in on these disputes, I do have a concern about the long-term impact on this crucial goal of halving inflation. We've got to drive inflation out of our system. It makes everyone poorer. It erodes everyone's wages. And, the lessons of the 1970s demonstrate that if you hike up wages during an inflationary spiral, you end up making the problem worse and last for longer. So I wish there were easier answers. I wish I could say something different. But I think for the moment, the focus has got to be on trying to reach some sort of fair resolution via the pay review process for the next financial year.
Well, look, we've got a proposal within Unite about how and where we find the money. There was a Treasury leak that said that the energy companies, I think the top 4 energy companies, are going to make excess profits of about 170 billion over the next 2 years. A one-off windfall tax of 50 billion pounds would more than take care of the situation in the NHS and would also help the rest of the economy as well. And I think the other point to perhaps make is that actually it makes economic sense to pay public service workers properly. If you pay NHS workers a decent wage, they will spend the money in the local economy. That generates revenues. The Treasury could actually end up recouping an awful lot of the money, is the reality, not just from the taxes that would be paid, but because people will go out and spend that money in the local economy. These are not people who are going to spirit the money away in offshore bank accounts somewhere. They're going to spend the money in the local economy. So surely it makes economic sense. But there's also, we're being told that the health of the nation is in peril, not just because of the strikes, but because people are falling ill and not being able to go to work. So it makes sense to have a decent NHS. But look, lastly, there's a moral argument here. We've seen statistic after statistic that talks about how people are needlessly, unnecessarily dying because of the crisis within the NHS. So we talk about the financial impact, but there's an impact on people's lives as well.
Just on that windfall tax, is that something that you've looked at in terms of the polling? Is it what's the kind of polling on that, people in favour of a windfall tax, especially on energy companies? This morning we saw Shell, I think, record the largest ever profit in its entire history. Yeah,
a windfall tax on energy companies is one of the most popular things you can ask about. It's right up there with, paying nurses the same as footballers. It's an incredibly popular, easy thing where you can just predict the answer, and I can tell you that if we put the question out tomorrow, the answer is going to come back with something like 70% approving.
Yeah.
It's against energy companies. People don't like energy companies. Energy is very much kind of a grudge purchase. People want it to be free and infinite. So yeah, it's in terms of public perceptions, it's an easy thing to argue for.
Theresa, I can hear the division bell ringing there. So I know you're going to have to head off in a second. One of the issues that Rishi Sunak has faced in this 100 days is he's had a couple of cabinet ministers have to leave under different circumstances. Dominic Raab, the Deputy Prime Minister, Justice Secretary, is facing huge amounts of pressure at the moment over accusations of bullying. There was discussion last night whether he was going to step aside while this investigation by the KC Adam Tolley goes ahead. He sort of pushed back against that. What have you kind of made of it? And do you think that Sunak perhaps needs to be a bit bolder and take these decisions earlier rather than waiting? Or do you think we need to kind of let this due process go? And what do you kind of make of the whole Raab situation?
The Prime Minister set up an investigation into Nadhim Zahawi's tax affairs. It reported very quickly. And as soon as the conclusions were published that the ministerial code had been broken, then Dean was asked to leave the government. So I think he did act swiftly. You have to make sure you have the facts of these situations before you take action. That's the fair and legal way to approach them. As with Dominic Raab, there is a detailed investigation underway, and I don't think we should prejudge that. Dominic is a dedicated and talented minister, and it's only appropriate that if complaints have been made about him, that they are appropriately investigated before a conclusion is reached on that. I know that the Prime Minister takes very seriously maintaining appropriate standards in his government. And
Yeah, he
I think
mentioned it as he
he's
mentioned it
shown
on
that.
the steps of down the street when he arrived. But obviously, he's had quite a few issues already. Do you worry perhaps that this is kind of the perception people might have of Sunak's administration as we go towards an election, that this is an issue that he can't rid himself of?
He's shown that he takes very seriously these matters related to the ministerial code. He has his ethics advisor appointed. He's acted swiftly in relation to Mr. Zahawi, and there is a rigorous process underway to investigate the complaints made about the Deputy Prime Minister. I think that is sufficient. Governments of all descriptions face these kinds of problems from time to time, and the Prime Minister is determined to take these very seriously.
But yeah, obviously, as Theresa points out there is this investigation going on. Doesn't want to prejudge it, but what's the kind of the public's perception, I suppose, of this? With Zahawi, there was a feeling, I suppose, that even if he'd been found to be absolved by the ethics investigator, the questions wouldn't have gone away. And even now he's been sacked, the questions haven't gone away for Sunak. I just wonder what the public perception was in polling of both Raab and also the way that Rishi Sunak has dealt with these situations.
Yeah. So again, the problem for Rishi Sunak is basically that all of his weaknesses are a result of the fact that he's in a really, really weak position, right? So there's a reason why the Labour Party's latched on to basically trying to portray him as weak, because that's the best way of trying to bring his ratings down, because they know that him being more popular than the Conservative Party generally is their biggest liability. So the thing Rishi Sunak has is that every single one of these events that happens, so being delayed on sacking Nadeem Zahawi can be portrayed as being weak. Any kind of delay on whatever the results are of the inquiry into Dominic Raab can be portrayed as being weak. The situation with the strikes and the disputes with the unions, again, you can portray it as weak. And it all adds to this kind of general sense where things just aren't really working, everything's kind of breaking down. You can't sort of guarantee being able to get somewhere if you want to go by train or even if you call an ambulance. And all of these things kind of feed off each other and build up this perception.
One of the things that he's tried to say as a strong thing to have done was to introduce these minimum service level legislation. Onay, what's been Unite's take on these the minimum service level, minimum safety levels, as sometimes they're called? What have you kind of made of the legislation, and how do you think it's going to affect kind of industrial relations over this next few weeks?
To not put too fine a point, it's a deflection. And it's a bit of a pathetic deflection. It's not going to resolve the cost of living crisis. It's not going to resolve the strikes. The fact that in the NHS, where we have disputes, we negotiate minimum safety levels anyway. So completely and utterly unnecessary. There's obviously the bigger argument that it is a fundamental attack on the right of working people to be able to withdraw their labour and take strike action. We do not accept for a minute that the government is trying to line up with similar standards in Europe, which is another line that's being used. That's complete and utter nonsense.
Yeah, some of the countries like France do have these kind of minimum service levels as well, don't they?
They do. A number of countries have them. The difference is they're negotiated locally. You negotiate them locally, and it's a pick and mix approach. So there are countries where you do not have to give 14 days notice before you take strike action, as you have to do in the UK. So the government have decided to take a pick and mix approach, but it is simply not going to resolve the issue. And in fact, it could have the opposite effect. It could actually prolong the length of disputes as a result, because it means that things don't come to a fore quickly, things become delayed. It could mean that unions look at action like strike action, short of action, work to rule, that kind of action, which again just prolongs disputes. So actually, it's going to make the situation worse. It's not going to resolve the crisis we're in, and it's going to make the situation worse.
Interesting. Adam said there that that looking at the polling, for the government, the thing they have to do is simply just pay the NHS workers. That's the only way to sort of resolve this kind of stuff. Your Unite tweeted today that saying that there's 5 days for the government to prevent this huge day of action on Monday. What do you want to see between now and then? Do you want to get in a room with Steve Barclay and others? What kind of needs to happen to prevent that action from taking place?
We will get in a room with Steve Barclay as soon as he is ready. But we do also need to be clear. We do need to be discussing about the issue that's going to resolve the current dispute. We can't do what's been done before, which is discuss everything but that. So if the government are willing to sit down and discuss with us, we will do it. We're ready at any point that they want to do that. And I emphasise again, we're ready to sit down and compromise.
That's all we've got time for this week, but you can read all the latest on the big stories from Westminster at PoliticsHome.com and keep right up to date by subscribing to our 7-day week newsletters by clicking on the link in the top right-hand corner of the website. Thanks to my brilliant guests, Theresa Villiers, Adam Drummond and Onay Kasab. Our editor today was Laura Silver. And thanks to you all again for listening. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review. If you want to get in touch, then reach out to us on Twitter at PoliticsHome or email us via news@politicshome.com. But for now, I've been Alain Tolhurst, and this has been The Rundown.